The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across Brookfield Park, a serene expanse of green nestled in a quiet American town. The park was a sanctuary for William Hayes, a retired teacher who had spent his life inspiring generations of students with lessons on resilience and justice. At 67, William found peace in these afternoons, sitting on a weathered wooden bench near the pond, surrounded by the hum of nature. Brookfield Park was more than a place of reflection for William. It was a link to his late wife, Eleanor, whose laughter had once echoed through the very trails he now walked alone. His cane rested beside him, a silent reminder of battles fought, both physical and moral, through a life that had seen both triumph and tragedy. Today, he had brought along a book, its worn edges a testament to its place as a companion during these quiet moments. Across the park, a group of young men ambled toward him. Their loud voices and exaggerated laughter disrupted the tranquil ambience. William glanced up briefly, recognizing their leader, Kyle Grayson. Kyle was infamous in town for stirring trouble, his bravado fueled by the small but growing network of like-minded individuals he had recruited. "Hey, old man." Kyle's voice cut through the stillness, dripping with mockery. The others laughed, emboldened by their leader's tone. William sighed inwardly, determined not to engage. He adjusted his glasses and returned his gaze to his book, hoping they would pass by. But he knew better. Trouble had a way of finding those who wished to avoid it. "Too good to answer us, huh?" Kyle continued, stepping closer. The group circled the bench, their postures menacing. William placed his book down carefully, his steady hands belying the quiet tension building within. "Good afternoon," William said calmly, looking directly at Kyle. His voice carried no fear, only the weight of experience. Kyle smirked, his gang inching closer. "You've got a lot of nerve sitting here like you own the place." "This park is open to everyone," William replied evenly. "I'm just here to enjoy the day." "Everyone?" Kyle sneered. "That's funny. People like you think you can just take over, don't you?" The insinuation wasn't subtle, and William felt a flicker of anger. He had faced prejudice before, but it never ceased to sting. His grip on his cane tightened slightly, though he kept his composure. "I've spent my life teaching young people about respect and fairness," William said. "It's disappointing to see that lesson hasn't reached everyone." Kyle's face darkened. "Respect? You don't deserve any." The gang closed in, their laughter turning to jeers. One of them reached for William's cane, knocking it to the ground. William remained seated, his heart steady despite the rising tension. He knew he couldn't physically match them, but he wasn't about to let them break his spirit. As the situation escalated, a voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Step away from him. Now." The gang turned in unison to see Ethan Hayes, William's son, standing a few yards away. Dressed in jeans and a jacket, his broad shoulders and firm stance made it clear he was no ordinary bystander. His piercing gaze fixed on Kyle, whose bravado faltered momentarily. "Who's this, your bodyguard?" Kyle scoffed, though his confidence wavered. Ethan stepped closer, his movements deliberate. "I said step away." Kyle hesitated, glancing at his gang before sneering. "We don't take orders from." Before he could finish, Ethan moved. In a blur of precision, he disarmed the nearest gang member who had reached for a makeshift weapon, his movements swift and practiced. The gang froze, their bravado crumbling under Ethan's sheer authority. "Let's go," Kyle muttered, retreating with his group. "This isn't over." As they disappeared into the distance, Ethan turned to his father. "Are you all right?" William nodded, a small smile of gratitude forming. "I am now. Good timing." Ethan picked up the fallen cane, handing it back to his father. "What were they doing?" "Trying to scare me," William said simply. "It seems hate has found a new home here." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Not if we have anything to say about it." The two men walked back toward William's house, the quiet tension of their conversation underpinned by years of unresolved distance. Ethan, a major in the U.S. Army, had spent much of his adult life overseas, driven by a sense of duty that often left little room for family. His return to Brookfield was unplanned, a leave prompted by a recent mission gone wrong and a need to reconnect with his roots. I didn't expect to see you here, William said, breaking the silence as they reached the porch. I didn't expect to stay, Ethan admitted. But after what I saw today, maybe it's time I did. William looked at his son, seeing not just the soldier but the boy he had raised. A boy who had always stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. Brookfield needs people willing to fight for what's right, William said. And so does this country. Ethan nodded, the weight of his father's words settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt a pull stronger than duty, a call to stand not just as a soldier but as a son, as a protector of the values his father had always championed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, father and son sat on the porch, the quiet determination between them promising that this was only the beginning. Ethan woke early the next morning to the faint smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. His father was already awake, as he always was, sitting at the small wooden table with a steaming cup in hand. The house was modest but filled with warmth, pictures of family on the walls, bookshelves overflowing, and a faint creak in the floorboards that Ethan remembered from his childhood. Yet, today, the home felt heavier, the events of the previous afternoon lingering in the air. Ethan poured himself a cup and sat across from William. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but charged with unspoken thoughts. You really think they'll be back? Ethan asked finally, breaking the quiet. William nodded solemnly. Kyle and his kind don't like being challenged. They see it as a threat. And bullies, they don't walk away from a fight. They double down. Ethan leaned back, his fingers drumming on the table. I've dealt with people like that before. Overseas, during missions. Different flag, same mentality. But this feels personal. It is, William said firmly. Hatred is always personal. And it's growing roots here, Ethan. It's not just about me or what happened yesterday. It's about something bigger. Ethan looked at his father, sensing the gravity of his words. What do you mean? William set his cup down, the clink of porcelain echoing softly. Brookfield isn't the town it used to be. People are afraid, divided. They whisper instead of speak, turn a blind eye instead of standing up. And that gang? They're just a symptom of a much larger disease. Ethan frowned, his military instincts kicking in. Then we need to figure out who's behind it. Hate groups don't operate in a vacuum. There's always someone funding them, organizing them. William nodded. But we'll need help. Later that day, the two men walked into the Brookfield Gazette, the town's small but tenacious local newspaper. The smell of ink and paper filled the air, and the hum of old printers provided a steady backdrop. Behind the counter sat Sarah Thompson, a journalist in her early 30s with a sharp gaze and an even sharper tongue. She looked up from her screen as they approached, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. William Hayes, she said, standing to greet him. What brings you here? William introduced Ethan, and after a brief exchange of pleasantries, they got to the point. Sarah's expression shifted from curiosity to concern as William recounted the events in the park. They've been causing trouble all over town, Sarah said, pulling a notebook from her desk drawer. Vandalism, harassment, even rumors of arson. And every time I try to dig deeper, I hit a wall. People are scared to talk. They don't want to believe that something like this is happening in their own backyard. Ethan leaned forward. What do you know about Kyle Grayson? Sarah opened her notebook, flipping through pages of scribbled notes. Kyle's been on my radar for a while. He's more than just a thug. He's connected to a regional network of hate groups. They're small, fragmented, but they work together when it suits them, sharing resources, recruiting new members. It's organized. William's brow furrowed. And no one's doing anything about it? Sarah shrugged, frustration evident in her voice. The police say they're watching, but hate groups know how to skirt the law. They operate in the gray areas, just enough to intimidate but not enough to get caught. And when someone does speak out, they're met with threats. I've had my fair share of anonymous messages. Ethan's jaw tightened. So we need proof. Something solid that forces the authorities to act. Sarah nodded. And we need to expose them publicly. Shine a light on what they're doing. They thrive on secrecy and fear. Take that away, and they lose their power. The three of them spent the afternoon piecing together what little they had. Names, locations, rumors. Sarah showed them a map she had been working on, with pins marking known incidents. Patterns began to emerge, each pin a thread in a tangled web of hatred spreading through the region. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Ethan stood by the window, staring out at the quiet street below. "They're not just spreading fear," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "They're laying the groundwork for something bigger. Recruitment, organization, action. This isn't random." William joined him at the window, his reflection in the glass lined with the wisdom of age. "Then we'll stop it. We've faced worse, haven't we?" Ethan glanced at his father, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, we have." That night, as they returned home, the air felt heavier, charged with anticipation. The quiet hum of the neighborhood seemed almost ominous. As they approached the house, Ethan noticed something unusual, a faint, dark smear on the front porch. His military instincts kicked in, and he motioned for his father to stay back. He stepped closer, his heart sinking as he saw the vandalism in full. Spray-painted slurs and symbols defaced the porch and walls, their message unmistakable. A crude warning scrawled across the door read, "Stay in your place." William's face remained stoic as he stepped forward, leaning on his cane. "They're trying to scare us." Ethan's fists clenched. "It's not going to work." But as the two men cleaned the hateful graffiti in the quiet of the night, they both knew this was just the beginning. The battle ahead would require more than resilience. It would demand action, unity, and an unwavering commitment to justice. By morning, the message on their door was gone, but its impact lingered. Over breakfast, Ethan laid out a plan. "We need to take this higher," he said. "If the local police won't act, we go to the state or federal level. And we need to dig deeper. Find their hideouts, their funding. Cut them off at the source." William sipped his coffee, his gaze steady. "And we rally the town. There are more good people here than bad, Ethan. They just need to be reminded of their strength." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Ethan and Sarah worked together, digging through public records and interviewing reluctant sources. William, meanwhile, reached out to old friends and community leaders, organizing a town hall meeting to address the growing threat. When the night of the meeting arrived, the town hall was packed. The air buzzed with tension as William stepped to the podium, his cane tapping softly against the wooden floor. He looked out at the crowd, seeing a mix of fear, anger, and determination. "Hate has no place in Brookfield," he began, his voice steady and strong. "It thrives on silence and division. But we are stronger than that. Together, we can stand against it." As he spoke, Ethan stood at the back of the room, his eyes scanning the crowd. He saw Kyle Grayson lurking near the exit, his face a mask of defiance. But as the crowd erupted in applause, Ethan noticed something else, a flicker of uncertainty in Kyle's eyes. For the first time, it seemed, Kyle realized he wasn't untouchable. And for the first time, Ethan felt they had the upper hand. The tension in Brookfield hung thick in the air as Ethan, William, and Sarah regrouped the day after the town hall meeting. The community had shown its support, but there was an undercurrent of fear. Kyle Grayson and his gang hadn't disappeared after the confrontation. If anything, their presence seemed more menacing, their silence an ominous prelude to something worse. Ethan leaned over Sarah's map in the dimly lit office of the Gazette. The pins marking incidents and suspected locations had multiplied since their last meeting. Sarah was relentless in her investigation, but even she seemed on edge. William stood nearby, his cane resting against a desk, his weathered face unreadable. "They're planning something," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "They're too quiet, too coordinated. We need to find their base of operations before they move." Sarah tapped a spot on the map. "I think this is our best lead. The old warehouse on the edge of town. It's been empty for years, but I've heard whispers that it's being used for meetings. Recruitment. Maybe worse." William's expression darkened. "A breeding ground for hate." Ethan nodded. "We can't just walk in. If they're operating out of there, they'll have people watching." Sarah hesitated. "We'll need proof if we want the authorities to act. Something solid. We're talking photos, documents, anything that ties them to this network." Ethan stood straight, his military instincts kicking in. "Then I'll go in." I've done this kind of thing before. William stepped forward. Not alone. You won't. If we're doing this, we're doing it together. Ethan turned to his father, concern flickering in his eyes. Dad, this isn't a battlefield. You don't have to. William cut him off, his voice steady. You forget. I've been standing up to bullies my whole life. I might not be as fast as I used to be, but I'm not sitting this out. Sarah raised a hand. I can help too. I'm not just a journalist. I know how to keep a low profile. Ethan looked at them both, realizing there was no point in arguing. Fine, he said finally. But we do this carefully. No risks we don't have to take. That night, the three of them parked a safe distance from the warehouse, cloaked in the shadows of nearby trees. The area was desolate, lit only by a single flickering street lamp and the faint glow of the moon. Ethan handed out earpieces, his military gear a stark contrast to the civilian attire of William and Sarah. Stay close to me, he instructed. If anything happens, we pull out. No arguments. William and Sarah nodded, their faces set with determination. As they approached the warehouse, the sounds of muffled voices and the occasional clang of metal reached their ears. Ethan motioned for them to stay low as they circled the building, looking for a way in. A side door, slightly ajar, caught their attention. Inside, the warehouse was a stark contrast to its crumbling exterior. Tables lined with pamphlets and propaganda materials filled the space, and crude banners with hateful symbols hung from the walls. A group of men sat in the center, their conversation laced with bitterness and anger. At the head of the group sat Kyle Grayson, his voice carrying above the rest. This town doesn't belong to them, Kyle snarled, slamming a fist on the table. They think they can tell us what to do, where to go. We'll show them. Ethan gestured for William and Sarah to stay back while he crept closer, his phone in hand to capture photos. His movements were silent, practiced, but the tension in the air was palpable. Every step felt like a risk. Sarah whispered through the earpiece. Get the materials on the table. Those look like plans. Ethan adjusted his position, angling the phone to capture the documents. Blueprints of public spaces, including the town square and local schools, came into focus. His stomach churned. They weren't just recruiting. They were planning something big. Suddenly, one of the men stood, his gaze sweeping the room. Did you hear that? He asked, his voice sharp. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. He gestured for William and Sarah to retreat, but it was too late. A loud clatter echoed through the warehouse as William accidentally brushed against a metal pipe. Who's there? Kyle shouted, his eyes narrowing as he stood. Check the perimeter. Ethan cursed under his breath, grabbing William's arm and pulling him toward the nearest exit. Sarah followed, her face pale but resolute. The sound of footsteps grew louder as Kyle's men gave chase. Outside, the trio sprinted toward their car, the cold night air biting at their faces. Ethan's military training kicked in, his movements precise as he guided William and Sarah. Behind them, shouts and the occasional crack of something heavy hitting the ground reminded them how close their pursuers were. They reached the car just as the warehouse door burst open. Ethan shoved Sarah and William inside, taking the driver's seat and starting the engine in one fluid motion. Tires screeched as they sped away, the warehouse shrinking in the rearview mirror. Did you get what we needed? William asked, his breath labored. Ethan nodded, his grip tight on the wheel. Photos, blueprints, and faces. It's enough to take to the authorities. Sarah leaned back, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. That was close. Too close, Ethan muttered. We're lucky they didn't see our plates. The next morning, they met with local authorities, presenting the evidence they had gathered. The sheriff, a cautious man named Alan Curtis, examined the photos and blueprints with a furrowed brow. This is serious, Curtis admitted, setting the papers down. But we'll need more than this to shut them down. We can't raid the warehouse without a warrant. Ethan's patience wore thin, and by the time you get one, they'll be gone. Curtis sighed. I'll do what I can, but the legal process takes time. Keep your heads down in the meantime. These people don't play fair. As they left the station, Ethan's frustration was evident. We don't have time to wait for red tape. We won't, William said. But we'll need to be smarter about our next move. Sarah chimed in. Kyle and his group are spooked now. They'll either go to ground or escalate. Either way, we'll need to be ready. Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. Then we stay one step ahead. If they want to escalate, we'll be waiting. The trio returned to William's house, their minds racing with possibilities. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, they had a clear picture of what they were up against. And they weren't about to back down. As the sun set over Brookfield, Ethan sat on the porch, his father beside him. The air was heavy, but their determination was unwavering. Whatever Kyle and his gang were planning, they would stop it. Together. The morning sun broke through the curtains of William's modest home, but neither William nor Ethan had slept much. The photographs and blueprints they had gathered the night before were spread out across the dining table. Each detail felt like a piece of a dark puzzle, a puzzle that hinted at a far-reaching and violent plan. Ethan's military instincts were on full alert. He stood at the table, his arms crossed, scanning every photo with a practiced eye. Sarah sat across from him, her laptop open as she typed furiously, cross-referencing the materials against her notes and public records. William leaned on his cane near the window, staring out at the quiet street, his face etched with concern. They're not just planning another attack, Ethan said, breaking the silence. They're organizing something bigger. These aren't random blueprints. They're targeting high-profile locations. Sarah nodded. Public spaces. The town square, the community center, even the schools. This isn't just about intimidation anymore. This is about making a statement. William turned from the window, his voice steady but grave. Then we need to stop them before they make that statement. Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. The problem is, we don't know when they're planning to move. They could be waiting weeks or planning to strike tomorrow. Sarah's fingers flew over her keyboard. I'll dig through what we've got. Maybe there's a clue we missed, a date, a pattern, anything. Good, Ethan said. I'll focus on gathering more intel. If Kyle's network is as big as we think, someone else will know their timeline. William watched them both, his pride and their determination mingling with his worry. And what about the town? He asked. If they're targeting public places, we need to warn people. Ethan shook his head. We can't. Not yet. If word gets out too early, it might scare them into hiding. Or worse, push them to act faster. William frowned but nodded reluctantly. Then we act fast. The trio worked tirelessly through the day. Sarah followed leads, calling contacts and tracing the connections between the gang and other hate groups in the region. William reached out to trusted community members, planting the seeds for a possible response if things escalated. Meanwhile, Ethan used his military contacts to dig deeper, leveraging favors to gather intelligence that the local authorities didn't seem capable of acquiring. By late afternoon, a breakthrough came. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from one of her informants, a local bartender who had overheard Kyle talking at the bar the night before. She read the text aloud, her voice tinged with urgency. They're meeting tonight, she said. Same warehouse. But this time, it's not just Kyle's crew. He's bringing in others, leaders from nearby towns. Ethan's expression darkened. A leadership meeting. They're coordinating. William straightened. That's our chance. If they're all in one place, we can shut them down. Sarah hesitated. It's risky. If they catch us again, they won't, Ethan said firmly. This time, we'll be ready. That night, under the cover of darkness, the trio returned to the warehouse. This time, they weren't alone. Ethan had called in backup, a small team of trusted allies from his military days who had agreed to help on short notice. The group moved with precision, each step calculated to avoid detection. From their vantage point outside the warehouse, they could see the gathering inside. The dimly lit space was packed with men and women, their faces hard and serious. Kyle stood at the front, his voice carrying through the open windows as he addressed the group. This isn't just about Brookfield, Kyle said, his tone fiery. This is about taking back what's ours. They think they can push us out, silence us, but we're stronger than they are, and we'll prove it. Ethan's jaw tightened as he listened. Beside him, Sarah snapped photos with a telephoto lens, capturing the faces in the crowd. William, crouched nearby, whispered, "This isn't a meeting. It's a call to action." Kyle continued, his voice growing louder. We move on Independence Day. While they're distracted, celebrating their so-called freedom, we'll show them what real power looks like. Ethan's stomach churned. Independence Day was less than a week away. The town square would be packed with families, vendors, and celebrations. It was the perfect storm for chaos. We need to call this in now, Ethan whispered, turning to his team. This is enough evidence to justify a raid. But before anyone could move, a noise from their position drew the attention of a guard outside the warehouse. He shouted, and within seconds, the scene inside erupted into chaos. Kyle's men rushed to secure the building, their eyes scanning the darkness for intruders. Ethan's team sprang into action. He barked orders, guiding his group to retreat while covering their tracks. Sarah clutched her camera, her breath coming in quick bursts as she followed Ethan's lead. William kept close, moving with surprising agility for his age, his cane doubling as a weapon when one of the guards got too close. Shots rang out, the sound echoing through the night. Ethan's team returned fire, their movements precise and controlled. The warehouse became a battlefield, the air thick with tension and adrenaline. Kyle's voice roared above the fray. Find them. Don't let them leave. Ethan grabbed Sarah and William, pulling them toward a nearby truck for cover. We need to get out of here now, he said, his voice sharp. What about the others? William asked, glancing at Ethan's team still engaged in the fight. They'll follow, Ethan replied. But we can't risk losing what we've got. That intel is our best chance to stop them. With a reluctant nod, William followed Ethan's lead. They slipped through the shadows, making their way back to their car as the sounds of the skirmish faded into the distance. Ethan's team regrouped moments later, bruised but alive. Back at William's house, the group reviewed the evidence they had gathered. Sarah's photos and recordings painted a damning picture of the gang's plans. The date, the target, the people involved, it was all there. This is enough, Sarah said, her voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and relief. We can take this to the FBI. They won't ignore it. Ethan nodded. We have to move fast. Independence Day is just days away. If we don't act now, people will die. William placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. You've done good tonight, son. We all have. Now, let's make sure it counts. As the first light of dawn broke through the window, the trio knew their fight was far from over. But for the first time, they had hope, a chance to dismantle the network of hate that had taken root in their town and protect the people they cared about. Together, they would see it through. The next morning, the atmosphere in William's house was electric with urgency. The evidence collected from the warehouse was undeniable, a chilling blueprint for chaos set to unfold during Brookfield's Independence Day celebration. Ethan, William, and Sarah knew they had to act quickly, but the weight of their mission was undeniable. Ethan leaned over Sarah's laptop, reviewing the photographs and audio recordings from the previous night. This is solid, he said, his voice steady but intense. We've got names, faces, plans. If this doesn't convince the authorities, nothing will. Sarah nodded, but her face betrayed her concern. We have to hope they act fast. Kyle and his group won't sit idle now. They know someone was watching. William sat by the window, his cane resting against the wall, his gaze fixed on the quiet street outside. Hope isn't enough. We need to be ready for whatever comes next. Ethan glanced at his father, admiring his resolve. We will be. By midday, Ethan had arranged a meeting with the FBI field office 2 towns over. He, William, and Sarah drove in tense silence, the evidence packed securely in Sarah's laptop bag. When they arrived, they were greeted by Agent Michelle Carter, a sharp-eyed woman with an air of authority. Major Hayes, she said, shaking Ethan's hand firmly, we've reviewed your initial reports. Let's see what you've got. In a small conference room, Sarah presented the evidence. Photos of the warehouse meeting, audio of Kyle's fiery speech, and the blueprints of their planned attack. Agent Carter's expression grew graver with each passing moment. This is serious, she said finally. We've been tracking groups like this, but this level of organization is alarming. We'll move on it immediately. Ethan exhaled, a flicker of relief crossing his face. What's the plan? We'll coordinate a raid, Carter replied. Simultaneous strikes on all known locations tied to Kyle's group. If we can dismantle their network before Independence Day, we can neutralize the threat. William leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. Do you have the manpower to pull it off in time? Carter hesitated. It's tight, but we'll make it happen. In the meantime, I need you three to stay out of it. You've done your part. Ethan bristled. With all due respect, Agent Carter, this is our town. We're not standing by while they're still out there. Carter's eyes met his, unwavering. I appreciate your commitment, Major, but I can't afford to have civilians complicating the operation. Ethan didn't argue further, but his clenched fists spoke volumes. That night, back in Brookfield, the tension reached a boiling point. William's house was quiet, but the silence felt ominous. Ethan sat in the living room, cleaning a handgun he had kept from his military days. Sarah worked on her laptop, updating her notes, while William read from an old notebook, jotting down thoughts in the margins. A sudden noise shattered the stillness, a crash from the back of the house. Ethan was on his feet instantly, his instincts sharp. He motioned for Sarah to stay low and gestured to William to take cover. The front door burst open, and three figures stormed in. Kyle's gang. They had come for retaliation, and this time, they weren't holding back. Ethan moved with precision, using the shadows to his advantage. He disarmed the first attacker with a swift strike, sending the man sprawling. The second lunged at him, but Ethan sidestepped and delivered a powerful elbow to the man's ribs, knocking him out cold. Meanwhile, Sarah had grabbed a heavy lamp, using it to fend off a third attacker who had made it to the kitchen. She swung with surprising force, the lamp connecting with a sickening thud. The man stumbled, dazed, before collapsing. But amidst the chaos, Kyle himself appeared, grabbing William and dragging him out the back door. You think you can stop us? Kyle snarled. We're just getting started. Dad! Ethan shouted, racing after them. He caught a glimpse of Kyle shoving William into a van before it sped off into the night. Ethan's heart pounded as he watched the taillights disappear. Hours later, in the aftermath of the attack, Ethan sat with Sarah at the police station, explaining what had happened to Agent Carter over the phone. They took my father, Ethan said, his voice raw with frustration. We can't wait for your raid. We need to find him now. Carter's voice was steady but urgent. We're tracking them. Your father is a priority. Stay put, and let us handle it. Ethan hung up, his jaw tight. I'm not staying put. Sarah placed a hand on his arm. Ethan, will find him, but we have to be smart about this. Ethan nodded reluctantly. Then we start with what we know. Kyle won't take him far. He needs leverage, and he needs to feel safe. That means somewhere familiar. Together, they combed through the evidence again, searching for clues. It was Sarah who made the connection. The farmhouse, she said, pointing to a photo of a dilapidated building near the edge of town. It's tied to one of Kyle's men. They've used it before. Ethan grabbed his gear. Then that's where we're going. The farmhouse was dark and eerily quiet as Ethan and Sarah approached. Armed with the knowledge that Kyle's gang was still out there, Ethan moved with caution, his military training guiding his every step. Sarah followed, her camera tucked away in favor of a flashlight. Inside, they found William tied to a chair, his face bruised but his spirit unbroken. Kyle stood nearby, pacing angrily. You don't scare me, William said, his voice steady despite his injuries. You're just a scared little boy, hiding behind hate. Kyle turned sharply, rage flickering in his eyes. Shut up, old man. Ethan burst through the door, his weapon trained on Kyle. Let him go. Kyle sneered, pulling a knife and holding it to William's throat. One step closer, and he's done. Sarah, unnoticed, slipped behind Kyle, her flashlight in hand. With a sudden movement, she swung, the metal casing connecting with Kyle's wrist. The knife clattered to the ground, and Ethan charged, tackling Kyle to the floor. Within moments, it was over. Kyle was restrained, his defiance fading into fear as police sirens echoed in the distance. Ethan untied his father, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. You okay, Dad? Ethan asked, his voice soft. William nodded, his eyes meeting his son's. Thanks to you. Back at the police station, Agent Carter greeted them with a mix of relief and frustration. "You should have waited," she said, but there was no denying the gratitude in her tone. "We've got Kyle. Now we can bring the rest of them down." As dawn broke, Ethan, William, and Sarah stood together, exhausted but triumphant. The battle wasn't over, but they had struck a critical blow against hate. And as the first rays of sunlight lit the sky, they knew they wouldn't stop until the fight was won. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as people filed into the gallery. Reporters jostled for the best seats, their cameras poised to capture the culmination of a harrowing battle for justice. At the defense table sat Kyle Grayson and the remaining members of his gang, their faces a mix of defiance and unease. Across the room, Ethan, William, and Sarah took their seats in the front row, their expressions resolute. The prosecution had built a solid case. The evidence collected from the warehouse and farmhouse was damning. Blueprints of public spaces, stockpiled weapons, and recorded speeches dripping with hate. Kyle's connection to a broader network of hate groups had been laid bare, ensuring this trial wasn't just about him but about dismantling the toxic ideology he represented. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. As the trial began, the prosecutor presented her opening arguments, weaving a narrative of deliberate planning, targeted violence, and a group bent on sowing fear. "This case isn't just about one act," she said, her voice strong. "It's about a coordinated effort to undermine our values and terrorize a community." The defendants sought to instill fear, but today, we stand united against them. The jury leaned in, their attention unwavering. Behind them, the crowd listened intently, eager to see justice served. Ethan and William had spent the days leading up to the trial preparing for their testimonies. William was the first to take the stand. As he walked to the witness box, leaning on his cane, the room seemed to hold its breath. His presence commanded respect, his age and dignity a stark contrast to the venom of the defendants. "Mr. Hayes," the prosecutor began, "can you recount the events that brought you here today?" William spoke with calm determination, describing the initial confrontation in the park, the escalation of threats, and the eventual kidnapping. He painted a vivid picture of the fear the gang tried to instill and the courage it took to stand against them. "They thought they could scare me into silence," William said, his voice unwavering. "But hate only wins when we let it. I've seen too much in my life to let fear dictate how I live." The defense attorney attempted to rattle him, suggesting that he had provoked the gang by refusing to leave the park. William's response was measured. "Standing my ground in a public space is not provocation. It's a right, and no one, no matter how loud or hateful, can take that from me." Ethan testified next, detailing the infiltration of the warehouse and the rescue operation at the farmhouse. He described the network Kyle had built, the calculated steps they had taken to target the town, and the decisive action required to stop them. "They weren't just a local gang," Ethan said. "They were part of something bigger, something dangerous, and they were ready to act." The prosecution's case was bolstered by testimonies from law enforcement and the FBI. Agent Carter presented the timeline of the investigation, connecting the dots between Kyle's local operations and the larger network of hate groups. "Their goal was to create chaos," Carter said, "to exploit fear and division for their own gain. But thanks to the bravery of individuals like William and Ethan Hayes, we were able to stop them." The defense, meanwhile, struggled to counter the mountain of evidence. Kyle's attorney painted him as a misguided young man manipulated by larger forces. But Kyle's recorded speeches and direct involvement in planning the attacks left little room for sympathy. When Kyle himself took the stand, his defiance returned. He claimed he was fighting for freedom and values, but his words rang hollow in the face of the evidence. "You call it freedom," the prosecutor said during cross-examination. "But what you really mean is domination, forcing others to live in fear. That's not freedom. That's oppression." Kyle had no answer. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with their verdict. The foreman stood, clearing his throat. "We find the defendant, Kyle Grayson, guilty on all charges," he said. "Conspiracy to commit violence, possession of illegal firearms, incitement of hate, and kidnapping." A ripple of relief and quiet celebration spread through the gallery. The other gang members were also found guilty, their sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years based on their roles in the operation. The judge's sentencing was firm. Kyle received 25 years without the possibility of parole. As he was led away, his defiance finally crumbled, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his fate. Outside the courthouse, the town gathered in solidarity. A spontaneous cheer erupted when Ethan and William emerged, flanked by Sarah and Agent Carter. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, but the family paused to address the crowd. "This isn't just about stopping one man," William said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "It's about standing against hate, wherever it exists. It's about choosing courage over fear, every single day." Ethan placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "We stood up because it was the right thing to do. And I hope this shows others that they can do the same. Together, we're stronger than fear." In the weeks that followed, Brookfield began to heal. The Independence Day celebration, which had been overshadowed by the gang's plans, became a symbol of resilience. Families filled the town square, waving flags and enjoying the festivities, their unity stronger than ever. William was invited to speak at the event, his words carrying a powerful message of hope. "Brookfield is more than a town," he said. "It's a community. And no matter what challenges we face, as long as we stand together, we will overcome." Ethan decided to stay in Brookfield, helping to establish a community outreach program focused on education and inclusivity. Sarah's articles exposing the broader hate network gained national attention, sparking conversations about vigilance and unity across the country. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan and William sat on the porch of their home, the air filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of crickets. "We did it," Ethan said, his voice soft. William nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We stopped them. But the fight isn't over." "No," Ethan agreed. "But we'll be ready for whatever comes next." As the first stars appeared in the sky, father and son sat together in quiet reflection. They had faced hate and overcome it. And though the road ahead would surely bring new challenges, they knew they would face them together. The battle for justice was ongoing, but in that moment, they allowed themselves the peace of knowing they had made a difference.